Welcome back. All right, so I want to talk about 6 teams that are off to slow starts and the question of whether or not there's a coach on the hot seat. Now, Arizona's on the board, but I'm aware there's no chance their coach is getting fired for the same reason that Jeff Blashill's had a lot of job security for years. That there wasn't really anything expected of his team, and that's the important thing is the team playing up to expectations. And in Arizona's case, they kind of are. They're 1-10-1. Last season, they were 24-26-6. No playoffs for them, of course. And so they decided, okay, let's just tear it down. And so they made the Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Connor Garland deal to Vancouver, basically signaling we're tearing it all down. And they've acquired a lot of draft picks. They acquired draft picks for Christian Dvorak going to Montreal. They basically took anybody who could put the puck in the net, who's not named Clayton Keller or Jacob Chychrun, and said, if we can sell these guys off, we will, and they did. So I want to use them as the starting point because I'm aware there's very little chance, basically no chance, that the Coyotes are going to. You don't have to do Rick Steiner math to know. Scott Steiner math. Rick Steiner was more about the dog, anyway, the dog face gremlin thing. But the Coyotes, there's no chance of them making the playoffs and no chance of them firing their coach. They've allowed the first goal in 8 of their 12 games. Do you know what's funny? I actually thought it would be higher than 8 out of 12 games that they've allowed the first goal. In those games, they're 1-7. I was also surprised they have a comeback victory in there. They have one loss when leading after one. So they don't lead after one very often. And so since they have the one loss leading after one, they have 11 losses altogether. They don't lead very often after the first. So their losses are many, plentiful. Let's look at who they've lost to. They lost to Columbus. Buffalo, that was in a shootout. St. Louis, Edmonton, the Islanders, Florida, Tampa, Washington, Carolina. Look at that murderer's row of teams, right? St. Louis, one of the best teams in the league to start the season. Edmonton, same. Islanders, been very good on this road trip for them. Florida, great start, 10-1-1. Tampa, 2-time Stanley Cup champions. Washington, 2018 Stanley Cup champions, off to a decent start themselves. Carolina, 9-0 to start the season. And Philadelphia off to a very good start. Anaheim, surprisingly been good. So for the Coyotes, I'm even going to say, you know what? Maybe they're better than their 1-10-1 record. Maybe they've just had a really rough schedule. They did defeat Seattle. Seattle has the designation as the one team that's been unable to defeat Arizona. And Kraken fans reacted as you would expect fans to react after they watched the Coyotes beat their team. And for Andre Tourigny, he was hired July 1st of 2021. No danger of him losing his job. So it doesn't matter how they play. Really, it's a matter of making sure they're working hard and, doing the best they can with what they have. Now, moving on to Colorado. 4-5-1 record to the start of the season. Last year, they were 39-13-4, and they won the President's Trophy. Expectations are quite high in Colorado, so that means there might be a little more pressure on the coach. They've allowed the first goal in 6 out of 10 of their games to start the season, and they're 1-5 in games where they allow the first goal. So that's a problem. They're not great at the comebacks. But when you look at who they've lost to teams that are pretty good out of the gate. St. Louis, Washington, Florida, so teams that Arizona lost to as well. Vegas, Columbus in a shootout, and then they lost to Columbus again in Columbus. So that was an interesting back-to-back they had with them over the last week. Now, teams they defeated Chicago. They defeated Tampa in a shootout. They defeated St. Louis, and they defeated Minnesota. So the 4-5-1 start is disappointing. The back-to-back losses against Columbus are disappointing. Those are games that you would expect a team that a lot of people picked to win the Stanley Cup. You would expect them to win those, and they haven't. So they sit below the playoff line in the West. But it feels like they have to get on a run at some point soon, right? So what's interesting with them, too, is that they hired Jared Bednar August 25th of 2016. Of the coaches on the board, Bednar's the one that's been there the longest. Now, in the event that Colorado, say, has a mediocre record up until the middle of the season, there will be some pressure for Joe Sakic to make a change behind the bench. Whether he does or doesn't, if he goes about it the way Joe Sakic normally does, there's a lot of patience there and Bednar isn't in any danger. But again, as we get further along in the season, if the record continues to be mediocre, there could be a change that happens there. Dallas. Dallas is an interesting one to me because as a fan of the Stars, and I'm a fan of Rick Bowness, and that run to the Stanley Cup Final was great. But Bowness's record as a head coach in the NHL is uneven. It is. If you look at his overall record, and you can look at the teams he coached, and you can make the argument about whether or not those teams were good enough and all of this. But Dallas out of the gate 4-5-2 last year, 23, 19, and 14. Dallas all by themselves last year made a mockery of the idea of a team being 500 in the NHL. They won 23 games out of 56 and were 4 games above 500 because of all the overtime and shootout losses they had. So no playoffs for them last year, and I was very glad they didn't, because if they had managed to lose enough games in overtime or shootouts to make the playoffs, I would have been unhappy with that. I don't like that system, so even if it benefits a team I cheer for, I don't like it. So they've allowed the first goal in 5 out of 11 games. Surprised me that 6 out of 11 they've scored first. They're 1-3-1 when they allow the first goal. So they aren't a team that's good at coming back from behind either. And usually early in the season is when it's easier to overcome those deficits. As the season goes along, defenses normally get better, and it becomes harder to win those games when you don't score first. So they have 1 loss when they're leading after 1. Notice Colorado doesn't have a loss when they're leading after 1, but Dallas has 1. They lost to Boston, so that's respectable. Ottawa, not as much. Columbus, off to a good start. Vegas in overtime, and then Ottawa again. We'll get back to Ottawa because that's an interesting one. Winnipeg in overtime, and then Vancouver defeats them 6-3. Vancouver finds their offense against Dallas. They defeated the Rangers in overtime, Pittsburgh in a shootout, LA in overtime, and Calgary in overtime. Dallas has this embarrassing distinction right now. They're the only team in the National Hockey League that does not have a win in regulation. They are 0 in regulation wins. That is your first tiebreaker. If they were tied for a playoff spot at the end of the year, they lose that tiebreaker to everybody. So Rick Bowness was hired as their coach December 10th of 2019, and I don't get the feeling that there's going to be a change behind the bench during the season, but if Dallas has a disappointing year overall, I would think that maybe they look for a replacement for Bowness at the end of the year. And as crazy as it sounds, we'll talk about just how absolutely ridiculous coaching careers are in the National Hockey League before this is done. So Montreal, 3-10. It's not been a good start. They were 24, 21, and 11. They were finalists. Notice they only won 1 more game than Dallas. But again, because of all those losses in extra time, they finished above 500 last year. And that run to the finals gave this appearance that they were a team that could end up winning themselves a championship at some point. But they lost Carey Price. They lost Shea Weber. They lost Philippe Danault. Kotkaniemi, of course, takes the offer sheet from Carolina. And just in general, this team has been in disarray the whole year. And while I like Jake Allen, without Carey Price, it just makes a big difference out there. So they've allowed the first goal in 8 out of 13 games. That's too many. They're 1-7 in games where they allow the first goal. That's also too many. You can't be 1-7 there. They have 2 losses when they're leading after 1. That's also too many. So there's a lot of things here for Montreal that are problematic. One of the reasons why I thought allowing the first goal is important is because it tells you that a team isn't necessarily ready to play. They're not ready to start. You would expect it to be about 50-50. When you allow that first goal 8 out of 13 times, that's an issue, but it's not the most egregious on the board. We'll get to that one. There's a reason I'm wearing the Canucks jersey. So they lost to, Montreal did, Toronto, Buffalo, the Rangers, San Jose, Calgary. That was Carolina to start the season. All of them in regulation to put them to 0-5. Then following victories interspersed here, they lose to Seattle, LA, Anaheim. That, of course, was the West Coast swing where they might have been able to turn around their season. Didn't. And also have lost to the Islanders and, of course, embarrassingly to Vegas. That loss to Vegas is one of those ones that could snap the team out of this. It could be one that they say, hey, we're better than this, we should have won that game, and they start putting something together, or not. Their wins this year, they defeated Detroit, then they defeated San Jose, and then they defeated Detroit again. So they have 2 out of their 3 wins against the same team, against the Detroit Red Wings. They like to play Detroit. They don't like to play anybody else. Dominic Ducharme was hired February 24th of 2021. I don't get the feeling that Montreal is going to look to make a change behind the bench. I would think that he has earned himself the right to at least finish out the year based on that finals appearance. That finals appearance alone, I think, makes it so that he ends up staying as their head coach at least until the end of this year. Be very surprised if he gets fired. But it is Montreal, and if fans and if ownership expected more, then Ducharme absolutely could end up finding himself out of there before the end of the year. So moving on to Ottawa, they're 3-7-1. Normally I would say, well, Ottawa doesn't have any pressure, but the GM at the start of the year said the rebuild is over. Now, for the rebuild to be over, the record needs to get better. The record hasn't gotten better. So being 3-7-1 is not good enough. It is not good enough for the Senators right now. And while we could make arguments about injuries and protocols having affected some of the teams on this board, Colorado being an obvious example, Ottawa, it just hasn't been working, right? So of course Brady Tkachuk holds out, and then they eventually sign him, and now he's back in the lineup. We'll see if that helps turn things around, but so far it hasn't. Last year they were 23-28-5 with no playoffs. What that record, of course, doesn't tell you is they were excellent in the second half of the season. They were abysmal in the first half of the season. They can't recreate last year. They can't be abysmal in the first half of this season and count on a huge comeback in the second half. Last year they didn't make the playoffs doing that either, so it's not a formula that works. They've allowed the first goal in 6 out of 11 games, which is, again, not bad, but they're 1-4-1 when they allow the first goal. That's a problem. They have 2 losses when they're leading after 1. They are tied with Montreal for the highest number on the board. That is also a problem. So they lost to Toronto. So these 2 teams have both lost to Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. San Jose, the New York Rangers, Washington, Chicago. So, of course, Chicago beating Ottawa is one of those ones that Ottawa's going to look back on and say, wish we'd won that. Minnesota in overtime. That was a crazy game because every Minnesota game this year is crazy. Vegas and Tampa. So, Vegas comes through, beats Montreal, beats Ottawa, and builds up the record a little bit, and then Detroit beats them. So, yeah, Tampa Bay, that last loss, I mean, Ottawa, they try, the effort's there. It just feels like they're a step behind and they're just not quite ready, right? But again, the pressure is on that the owner expects the team to start getting better, and if Eugene Melnyk expects things to start getting better, they better start getting better, right? They've defeated Toronto, and then they've defeated Dallas twice, separated by a few games, but they've managed to defeat Dallas twice. The bad news is they don't face Dallas for the rest of the season. So the good news for Dallas, they don't have to deal with the juggernaut that is the Ottawa Senators, and for the Senators, they don't get to deal with Dallas anymore. So that's a weird one, right? That 2 of their 3 wins are against the same team in a different conference. So the only team in their own conference they've defeated is Toronto, who they've also lost a game against. They've got 2 more matchups with them left this season. But yeah, it feels like in a year where they should be making that next step or things should be getting better, they're not. And so for DJ Smith, who was hired May 23rd, 2019, it's possible that at some point this year we see a change behind the bench for the Ottawa Senators, especially if management's expecting this team to stay in the hunt for the playoffs. And they may not wait that long either. This may be one of those things where they look and they say, we can't afford to wait, because if we wait, we're just going to be done. So it may be one of those things where I would say 3-4 weeks from now, we may have a better idea as to whether or not DJ Smith's the coach for the whole year. So last team on the board's Vancouver. They're 5-6-1. It's not an abysmal record, but the 2-4 homestand is a problem. So they're 23-29-4 last season. No playoffs. And of course, they had the big outbreak on their team. There were a lot of guys got sick, and then they had the huge crammed schedule to end the season, which just was a mess, right? But even without that, the team wasn't quite clicking. So really, to me, the egregious thing with Vancouver is they've allowed the first goal 10 out of 12 games. They're 4-5-1, however, when they allow the first goal. I will say this, they have more wins when allowing the first goal than everybody else, right? And yet, they're allowing the first goal way too often. So that's a problem. They have one loss when they're leading after one. They lost against Edmonton in a shootout. They lost to Detroit, Buffalo, Minnesota, Philadelphia. Another loss to Edmonton, that one in regulation. And then most recently losing to Nashville. They defeated Philadelphia via a shootout. They defeated Chicago, Seattle, the New York Rangers in overtime, and Dallas. And Travis Green is the coach who's been here the longest, not named Jared Bednar, April 26th of 2017. So as crazy as it may seem for me to have these 6 teams on the board, it's kind of early in the season yet, the reality is coaches are very easily replaced. I said in a video a couple days ago, it feels to me like every coach should just be referred to as an interim coach. And there's a reason for that. There have been 9 new coaches hired in the NHL since January 1st of 2021. This year, 9. There were 5 hired in 2020 that are still employed. There were 8 hired in 2019 who are still employed. That means we have 22 coaches hired since April 15th of 2019. That's a time of 939 days, which means you're getting a new coach. I had to put it through the calculator because I'm like, how often? You get a new coach in the NHL every 42.6 days. That includes off seasons, that includes holidays, that includes the major shutdown they had for half of 2020, and you still have a coach being fired every 6 weeks. And so it is a job where, as Roger Nielsen once said, you are hired to be fired. And Roger Nielsen was a head coach that I thought was a good head coach, but he bounced around the league like crazy. And I do wonder how many of the coaches on this board are going to be gone by the end of this season. And there are going to be others that aren't on this board that end up being out as well. You're going to have teams that make the playoffs, lose in the first round, and then they're done. If the Toronto Maple Leafs make the playoffs this year and lose in the first round, does Sheldon Keefe get retained as coach? If the Vegas Golden Knights fall short of the playoffs, is DeBoer done? How safe is McClellan in LA? What about Dallas Eakins in Anaheim? When their expectations go up, is he still the coach? I've also found that there are a few coaches that don't get a lot of criticism, but most get a ton of criticism. And it is always interesting to me just how many coaches get criticized, and they are disposable in their jobs. And the other interesting part being that very often the guys who get hired are coaches who were fired by other teams, sometimes within days, weeks, months, and they're hired somewhere else. And so there is the perception that coaches are just recycled around the NHL, and there's something to that. But there you go. So which coach is on the hot seat? Which coach do you think ends up being out first? And I'm expecting people to probably vote for Green. But there are others that may. I still think DJ Smith in Ottawa, this is the year where there's expectation. Not necessarily playoffs, but improvement. And Ottawa hasn't really shown that yet. So we'll see what happens. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And if I'd done this a week ago, Chicago would have been on the board. But they already fired their coach, so they're not on the board. Thanks again for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.